Today's lecture covers tips for writing effectively. Included will be titles, introductions, and conclusions, as well as suggestions for paragraphs and what not to do as well. Before we get started, something to keep in mind is that just because the title is the first thing people see and introductions the first thing they read and conclusions are the last, these don't have to be written in that order. If you get stuck on one of them because of their proximity to the beginning or end of the essay, just go ahead and move somewhere else. That's my advice, and that's my justification for why outlines are good too. If you have an outline and you get stuck at a part that you have to write, you can just leave it there, maybe add some additions to your outline and go to something else. You shouldn't have to really force things too much. Titles, introductions, and conclusions happen at the beginning or end, but they're hard to think of until you're ready to do them. You don't have to introduce something that you don't even know because you haven't even written it yet. If you change them, which you always can do, be sure and go back and correct them or update them as well. While what follows are suggestions for titles, I would challenge you to try and find a professionally written movie, book, song, album, or whatever, and see that they don't follow these guidelines for how to title your essay. You could always start with a quote from someone. Now, a couple things. Be sure you know who sent the quote. If you're using a quote in your introduction, don't open with a title because you don't want to start repeating yourself. Make sure, of course, the quote is related to what it is you're writing about. Now, the recommendation for a title that I feel I innovated, although it's not an entirely novel idea, would be to use an interesting phrase from within the essay, something you came up with yourself. Now, don't try and force yourself to come up with something that encapsulates the whole essay, but get to writing, and in your hundreds or thousands of words, you'll find something just randomly, beautifully written, evocative, or, like I said, sums up the whole thing. And you get credit for originating this, and it seems to fit very nicely. If you're not as creative, you might try using a purely functional title which describes what the essay is doing. If you're doing something that does not require creativity or is a more academic piece, you might stick to a purely functional title. Again, avoid just restating your thesis because that might seem redundant, and even if that's not a factor of the grade, it will detract from the overall feeling your reader might have. There are some advanced tips for titles if you're willing to try it. You could always use an ironic title. The point of the title is to say, hey, look at this, but sometimes you're using that to distract and catch your reader for a loop. You might also try puns, which will detract from the seriousness of your essay. If you're writing something a little sillier, that might not be a problem, but if you do want to be taken seriously, you might avoid using puns. I have listed here tips for how to make your introduction. I won't reread over all of them. You can certainly look at them yourself. The gist of what's here is that you might want to try and find some interesting, shocking, useful, scary information and use that to get the reader's attention. An introduction needs to do that, but how can you do that for writing? Well, you try to see what works on you. If you don't want to do that, well, some of the other tips might work. I've simplified a suggestion for the introduction. Merely state why it is you are concerned or you care about your topic. This could be a story of what's happened to you or just why it matters to you. Now, the whole rest of the essay will be about convincing the reader as to why they should care about whatever it is you're writing about. So this is not a directive at the beginning of the essay merely for you to say this is why it matters to me, and your reader, having chosen to read you and being already somewhat sympathetic, will take it as, okay, well, this person cares about their topic, this person is a good source for me to listen to. The introduction is your first impression. You can overcome a bad first impression, but a good first impression will make your reader or instructor think, hey, this person can be relied upon to actually write something useful, and well, it'll help you out in the long run. You want to convince your reader early on that you're worth listening to, and you're also the person they want to get information from, and a good introduction can do all these things. There are some things you'll want to avoid for an introduction, however. You do not want to make an announcement that is, I'm going to tell you about why I think blah blah blah. More on that when we get to talking about thesis statements, but generally the I'm going to write about why I think part can be removed from that same sentence, and you probably have your thesis right there. You'll want to keep it short, a paragraph or so, because this is like the gift wrapping of an essay or the bun of a hamburger. It's not why people have shown up. You'll want to use maybe one of the previous suggestions. You might get away with two if you need to do some kind of attention getter, but also give some background information on your topic. Beyond that, you'll want to avoid discouraging your reader. Now, if it's for a class, early mistakes, errors, or weaknesses in writing will do this for your instructor. In the real world, though, if you say something inflammatory, you will get readers to tune out just as frequently as they will be flabbergasted as to how someone could say something like this. So it's not the appropriate thing to do for an academic paper, but it might be useful for other types of writing as well. You'll want to be overly casual or chatty. You're trying to show that you know how to write and do what most people don't know how to do, and this is what the mistake a lot of people make. You also want to know that after the readers read the introduction, they know what it is you're talking about. A good introduction and a clear thesis will do just that. I have a pretty straightforward suggestion for your conclusion. Just think of the question, what's next? Pretend that your reader is convinced by the entire rest of your essay, and you've done your job, and you're both on the same side, and what do we do now? You don't have to have a definitive answer. You just want to play with this idea and get it into a readable thing to put on your essay. Now, the thing with conclusions in real life is there's a couple different versions of them. Some don't apply to writing. Obviously, there's always the end, but unless you're writing a narrative or story, the end is not a conclusion for an essay. A conclusion is where you arrive to after you think about something for a while. You reach that conclusion. If you have one of those, put that somewhere there at the end. However, if you're exploring a well-tread topic, you might not have any new conclusions about it, and you still have to write one for the essay. So I have some suggestions for that. You could remind the reader of the topic's importance. You can do the opposite of my main advice. Pretend that you didn't convince them. Pretend that you haven't done your job, and so you make one last plea with the reader. Say, hey, you may not agree with me, and you don't think we should do what I want you to do, but we have to do something. This is a good sentiment to end, because your reader might think, hey, this person's not making it about themselves, and so I might need to give them a second look or a second thought. You might say, this is what we should do now that you're convinced. This is the next step. You can also do what worked for the introduction. So if you're telling a story, don't tell the whole story. Leave it with a little bit of a cliffhanger in the introduction. Say the conclusion of that story for the end. Similarly, interesting facts, details that you opened with, don't use all of them there at the beginning. Save one or two concluding, feeling, tips, or ideas for the end. And what do I mean by that? What I mean by concluding is that, let's say an essay that's 4 pages takes about 5-10 minutes to read. You could say in the 10 minutes is taken to read this essay, 5,000 miles of the rainforest have disappeared. So let's get on that. Now, there are some things that you want to avoid doing for your conclusion. A lot of advice that books and other classes might have for the conclusion would be to summarize your whole essay. if you're giving a speech, that might be useful, but you don't need to remind me what I just read, having just read it. And if you do, you need to go back and fix what you just wrote, not tell me to, hey, go read it again. If your idea, your thoughts have changed through the course of your research or whatever, you might speak to how that happened and illustrate that change your conclusion, but you can't presume that it's happened for your reader. Your conclusion is your closing thoughts, and so some of the advice I've already given you would avoid the mistakes to be made, but there's still other ones to do. Don't plant a flag on your essay and say to sum up in conclusion, or it can be seen then. These transitions are better saved for the essay itself in the body, but they won't turn a bad conclusion into a good one or change a final paragraph that's not a conclusion into a conclusion. Don't introduce new points. If you have more points, keep writing, put them in the body of the essay and think of something else. Don't weaken your stance or apologize for what you've done. Be positive. If you think you've written a good essay, go ahead and feel good about it. If you don't know if you've done a good or bad job, well, be positive. And if you've written a bad one, don't turn it in. Go back and fix it. I have now some suggestions for how you might introduce and conclude your narrative. For your introduction, you have a number of options. I would recommend doing each of these and see what you're the most satisfied with. If your story is based around a saying, a quote, some words to live by, open with that and maybe say what you feel or think about it, how you thought it was one way and at the end of the story things changed. You might have a flashback. You'd be surprised by how many things in life we've gone through. We find ourselves repeating that same thing until we learn. We hit our head against the wall until we know better. If there's something central to the story, or you want to start somewhere or with someone as your focus, you can just describe them or that thing and let that be the opening image which you have in your reader's head. Consequently, you're probably not the only one who's experienced what you've gone through. If you know of a similar story or experience, or another movie, something you've read that offers insight in what's happened that you ignored or you listened to this time around, a story might be a good way to open up your story. Or you could just dive right in. The personal narrative is not like very many other essays, and it has its own rules and feelings, so just start telling your story. Consequently, for your conclusion, you can cut your intro stuff in half. If you're opening up, talking, or referring to another work of literature, story, movie, or even song, don't say the whole thing. Save half of it for the beginning and leave a cliffhanger with that and say, we'll find out what happens at the end, but let's find out how what I went through. You can talk about the lesson there, how you learned something new or what was different this time. You might want to be careful though, because this could make your essay seem somewhat childish, but then again, if you want to explain how you feel about the events and that has not been the focus of your whole essay, it's appropriate to conclude with that. You might also, again, look ahead. What's the next step of the story, but don't take it. Conclusions are just new beginnings. Think of how we've gone through in life. You start out a baby, you become a child, you go through school and become a teenager, then you become a young adult, then finally an adult into middle age, and then being elderly. In school, you start out elementary, you go to junior high and high school, but that doesn't end, because then you go into the workforce, to your career or college, grad school, then whatever. So some suggestions for what you can do for that. Let me know what you think.